I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the sound of the rain beating against the single-pane windows of your childhood home. Imagine the sharp, comforting whistle of a kettle on a gas stove and the deeply familiar, earthy smell of potatoes boiling in a heavy enameled pot. Do you feel that warmth spreading through your chest? Today, we are traveling back to the 1970s and 1980s in the Netherlands. We are going to look at 25 humble, incredibly cheap meals we ate when there was absolutely no money left at the end of the month. Although we will explore 20 distinct memories today, they capture the essence of a time when empty wallets did not mean empty hearts. Some of these dishes might seem absurd to the younger generation today, but to us, they taste like pure nostalgia. And make sure you stay until the very end, because the final meal we talk about is perhaps the most touching, a true symbol of a mother's unconditional love during the hardest of times. Before we step into those cozy vintage Dutch kitchens, let us remember how time used to feel. Back then, time flowed at a completely different pace, much like the gentle, quiet waters of the Amsterdam canals. There was no rushing, no constant buzzing of smartphones, and no instant gratification. Waiting for your food to cook, waiting for a letter to arrive, waiting for your favorite television program to start, waiting was simply an art form we all mastered. People today often think that without modern technology and endless wealth, our lives must have been emotionally poor. But you and I know the absolute truth. Life was actually so much richer. The kitchen was the beating heart of the home. The warm stove kept the damp coastal chill away, and it drew the whole family together in a small space. We talked, we argued, we laughed, and we shared whatever little food we had. Being frugal was not a trend. It was a necessary way of life, an unspoken rule of survival that taught us deep gratitude. A simple meal, prepared with care, held more emotional weight than the most expensive restaurant dinner today. We learned to find profound joy in the smallest of things, and that is a kind of wealth that money simply cannot buy. Think back to the heavy enameled pot sitting on the stove, simmering away for hours. Brown beans with bacon and syrup, or, as we affectionately called it, bruinbonen met spek, was a staple that carried countless Dutch families through the hardest, coldest weeks of the month. When the wages were spent and the purse was light, this dish was a true culinary savior. You could buy dried brown beans for just a few pennies, soaking them overnight in a large bowl of water on the counter. The next day, the kitchen would fill with the deeply savory aroma of those beans boiling down, becoming incredibly tender and rich. But the true magic happened when the meal was finally served. We would sit around the worn wooden dining table, the single lamp casting a warm glow against the rainy darkness outside. Mother would spoon a mountain of those hearty beans onto our heavy ceramic plates. Then came the small scattering of crispy, salty bacon bits, fried until they were perfectly crunchy. And finally, the crowning glory, a generous pour of thick, dark molasses syrup, or stroop. The way the sweet, sticky syrup melted into the hot, salty fat of the bacon created a flavor profile that was nothing short of miraculous. It was a dense, heavy meal that stuck to your ribs and kept you warm long after you went to bed in a chilly room. We did not feel poor when we ate this. We felt completely, wonderfully full. Let us turn our memories to another brilliant way our mothers stretched a tight budget, the beloved wentelteefjes, our version of French toast. In a traditional Dutch household of the 1970s, absolutely nothing was ever thrown away. Throwing away bread was considered practically a sin. When the loaves became too hard and stale to chew, they were magically transformed into a warm, sweet feast. Mother would take those rock-hard slices and soak them in a shallow dish filled with a splash of milk and a single, carefully beaten egg. We would stand by the stove, watching as she melted a small knob of butter in the frying pan. The moment the soaked bread hit the hot butter, a glorious hiss would fill the room, followed immediately by the intoxicating scent of frying batter. But the best part was the topping. We would sprinkle a thick layer of cinnamon and white sugar over the hot slices. The sugar would instantly melt into a crisp, caramelized crust. Eating wentelteefjes felt like a luxury, a special treat reserved for Wednesday afternoons or a lazy weekend morning. As children, we had no idea that we were eating leftovers designed to save money. We only knew that our house smelled like a bakery and that every sweet, buttery bite made us feel incredibly lucky and deeply loved. Now, try to recall the freezing, dark winter nights in the Netherlands when thick frost grew like crystal ferns on the inside of your bedroom window panes. This was the season of stampot boerenkool, the traditional mashed potatoes with finely chopped curly kale. It was the ultimate winter survival food, costing next to nothing but providing all the energy we needed to brave the biting winds on our bicycles. The potatoes were cheap, often bought in massive 10-kilo sacks that sat in the dark cellar. The kale was equally inexpensive, deeply green and slightly bitter. Mother would boil them together in one massive pot until soft, then aggressively mash them into a vibrant green mountain on our plates. But the true ritual, the absolute highlight of eating stampot, was creating the koeltje jus. With the back of our spoons, we would carefully dig a small crater right in the center of our potato mountain. Into this little well, Mother would pour a ladle of dark, rich, savory gravy. The strict rule at the dinner table was that you had to eat around the edges, carefully preserving the dam. Breaking the walls and letting the gravy flood the plate too early was a tragedy we tried hard to avoid. It was a playful, comforting ritual that turned a simple, cheap plate of vegetables into a wonderful game, bringing smiles to our faces despite the freezing weather outside. Another vivid memory from those frugal times is the incredibly humble broodpap, or bread porridge. This dish is the very definition of making something out of nothing. Throughout the week, every crust of bread, every leftover heel that was too tough for a sandwich, was dutifully saved in a special tin box on the counter. When the tin was full and the household money box was empty, it was time for broodpap. Mother would tear the stale crusts into pieces and throw them into a saucepan with some milk. It was slowly simmered on the lowest flame of the gas stove, stirred constantly with a wooden spoon until the bread completely dissolved and turned into a thick, warm, comforting paste. On its own, it tasted quite bland, almost like warm, wet cardboard. But that is where the magic of dark brown sugar came in. We were allowed to sprinkle a generous spoonful of bastardsuiker over the steaming bowl. Within seconds, the sugar would melt into dark, sweet, molasses-flavored puddles on the surface. We would scrape our spoons along the top to get the perfect ratio of sweet sugar to warm porridge. It was a penny-pinching meal, often eaten for dinner when times were exceptionally tough, but it felt like receiving a warm hug from the inside out. It taught us to respect food and to find true comfort in the simplest of ingredients. As we moved through the 1970s, new influences slowly began to creep into our traditional Dutch kitchens. One of the most unforgettable and, in hindsight, quite amusing meals was macaroni met smaak. This was our mother's brave attempt at cooking exotic Italian food, though no Italian would ever recognize it. We did not have fresh basil, garlic, or expensive Parmesan cheese. Instead, we had a bag of cheap, curved macaroni pasta, boiled until it was completely soft and surrendered any texture. To this, we added cubes of smaak, a highly processed, incredibly cheap canned spiced meat that could sit in the pantry for years. The meat was fried in a pan until the edges turned a dark, crispy brown. Then, everything was mixed together. To finish this modern masterpiece, we would squirt a massive, heavy mountain of sweet tomato ketchup right on top. It sounds absolutely absurd today, and modern chefs would likely faint at the sight of it, but to us, it was a revelation. We would eat it eagerly on a Tuesday night while sitting quietly in the living room, watching the single television channel broadcast its evening program. That sticky, sweet, salty combination of overcooked pasta and canned meat was the height of culinary excitement for a Dutch child, a cheap thrill that remains permanently etched in our taste memories. Let us take a moment to remember a dish with perhaps the most poetic name in the entire Dutch culinary vocabulary, hete bliksem, which translates directly to hot lightning. This meal was a brilliant, incredibly frugal autumnal dish that utilized the cheap windfalls from the garden or the local market. It was essentially mashed potatoes aggressively mixed with both sweet and sour apples. Sometimes a little bit of cheap bacon fat or a small sausage was added if the budget allowed, but often it was just potatoes and apples. The apples would break down during the cooking process, turning the mash into a sweet, tart, deeply savory delight. But it earned its dramatic name for a very specific reason. The high moisture and sugar content of the apples meant that the mash retained its boiling heat for a remarkably long time. If you were too hungry too impatient, and took a large bite without blowing on it first, you would instantly burn the roof of your mouth as if struck by hot lightning. We all learned our lesson the hard way. Sitting at the table, we would carefully blow on our spoonfuls, watching the steam rise into the cool kitchen air. It was a dish that forced you to slow down, to practice patience, and to appreciate the beautiful, simple harvest of the autumn season. There was one meal that symbolized the absolute rock bottom of the household budget, yet it was served with a sense of dignity that I will never forget. We called it a boterham met tevredenheid, which literally translates to a slice of bread with satisfaction. When you hear this today, it sounds almost like a joke, but back then, it was a profound lesson in gratitude. When the cupboards were entirely bare and there was no cheese, no peanut butter, not even a jar of cheap jam, Mother would hand us a slice of plain brown bread. Perhaps, if we were lucky, it had a paper-thin scrape of margarine on it. There was no topping. The topping was contentment. It was a reminder that we had a roof over our heads, a warm stove, and each other. We would sit in silence, chewing the dense bread, actually tasting the grains and the yeast, paying attention to the texture. It was completely absurd by today's standards of endless supermarkets and overfilled refrigerators, but eating a slice of bread with satisfaction taught an entire generation that happiness is not found in what you consume, but in your attitude towards what you have. It was a humbling, deeply grounding experience that shaped our characters far more than any extravagant feast ever could. No journey through nostalgic Dutch food would be complete without paying homage to the legendary erwtensoup, affectionately known as sneert. This was not just a soup, it was a project, a thick, green, bubbling testament to frugality and patience. Split peas were incredibly cheap and could be stored forever. Mother would put a massive cast iron pot on the stove filled with water, split peas, onions and carrots. Then came the cheap cuts of meat, perhaps a pig's trotter or some tough bacon rinds, parts of the animal that cost mere pennies but provided a deep, rich, smoky flavor. The soup would simmer for hours, sometimes an entire day, until the peas completely dissolved. The ultimate test of a good sneert was that it had to be so thick, so dense, that a wooden spoon could stand straight up in the center of the pot without falling over. And the wonderful secret of this cheap meal was that it always tasted better on the second or third day. Coming inside from playing in the freezing Dutch rain, taking off our wet coats and being handed a steaming mug of leftover sneert was pure heaven. It warmed your hands, thawed your frozen nose, and filled your empty stomach with a comforting heaviness that made you feel completely safe and secure. For many of us, breakfast, lunch, and sometimes even dinner was defined by the large, round, cardboard tin of Quaker oats sitting proudly on the kitchen counter. Havermoutpap, or oatmeal porridge, was the fuel that powered an entire generation of Dutch children for pennies a day. Preparing it was a daily ritual. Milk was often watered down to make it last longer, or we simply used water if things were really tight. The oats were boiled on the stove until they transformed into a thick, sticky, greyish paste. It was heavy, dense, and remarkably filling. We needed that heavy fuel in our stomachs because we had to ride our heavy steel bicycles for miles against the notorious, unrelenting Dutch wind to get to school. To make the bland porridge palatable, we would bury it under a small mountain of sugar or a spoonful of cheap syrup. I can still hear the sound of the spoon scraping the bottom of the deep ceramic bowl, trying to get every last sweet drop. It was not a glamorous meal. In fact, many of us grew tired of it. But looking back, that simple bowl of havermoutpap represents the quiet, steady resilience of our mothers, making absolutely sure we never left the house with an empty stomach, no matter how little money was left in the jar. Let us move on to a dish that made us feel like adventurous sailors, even if we were just sitting in a small terraced house in Rotterdam or Utrecht. It was known as the Captain's Dinner, starring capuchinas, those deeply dark, wrinkled, marrow-fat peas. This dish was an exercise in extreme frugality that somehow tasted like a royal banquet. The dried peas were absurdly cheap. We would boil them until they were soft and creamy on the inside, but still held their tough, earthy skins. The real magic happened in the frying pan. Mother would chop a mountain of cheap yellow onions and fry them slowly in a little fat until they were deeply caramelized, sweet, and almost melting. We would mix the sweet onions with the earthy peas. Because fresh vegetables were expensive, we relied on sour preserves to balance the meal. pickled onions, gherkins, or a spoonful of cheap mustard were added to the plate. The contrast between the heavy, starchy peas, the sweet fried onions, and the sharp, biting acidity of the pickles was an explosion of flavour. We felt like captains of a great ship, dining on preserved goods after months at sea. It was a brilliant illusion, a way to make a dinner of cheap, dried beans feel like a grand, historical adventure. Another cornerstone of the frugal Dutch kitchen was hutspot, the famous carrot and onion mash. While it holds a legendary place in history due to the Siege of Leiden, for us in the 1970s, it was simply the meal we ate when the guilders were running dangerously low at the end of the month. Winter carrots were huge, incredibly cheap, and practically indestructible. We would boil these sweet, bright orange giants in a pot, along with cheap, starchy potatoes and sharp onions. Mashing them all together created a vibrant orange dish that smelled earthy and sweet, filling the damp kitchen with a comforting, warm aroma. Sometimes, if there was a tiny bit of budget left, a small piece of braised beef, known as klapstuk, was served alongside it. But more often than not, it was just the bare mash, perhaps enriched with a little leftover bacon fat or a splash of milk. Eating hutspot was a communal experience. The steam rising from the orange mountain on your plate fogged up the cold windows. It was a heavy, sweet, satisfying meal that demanded nothing but a fork and a good appetite. It reminded us that the earth provides, and that with a little effort, the cheapest roots and tubers can be transformed into a feast. If oatmeal was our heavy fuel, then Brinta was our quick emergency energy. I am sure you remember that iconic bright yellow box with the red letters sitting on the pantry shelf. Brinta, a fine whole wheat flake cereal, was a uniquely Dutch phenomenon. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was incredibly versatile. The ritual of making a bowl of Brinta required absolute precision and timing. You would pour hot milk over the dry flakes and stir rapidly. If you got the ratio wrong, or if you waited even a minute too long, the porridge would absorb all the liquid and turn into a solid block of concrete. You practically needed a hammer and chisel to get it out of the bowl. We had to eat it quickly while it was still hot and creamy. Sometimes we added a spoonful of sugar or a small piece of butter that would melt into a golden pool in the center. Brinta was often served on cold winter mornings, but it was also a frequent dinner substitute when mother simply had no money or time to cook a full meal. We would sit in our pajamas, the rain lashing against the glass, frantically spooning the warm wheat porridge into our mouths before it set. It was a race against time, a childhood game wrapped in a truly frugal meal. Let us recall a dish that perfectly illustrates the Dutch genius for combining the hot and the cold, the bitter and the buttery. Andijvie stampot, or raw endive mash, was a masterpiece of cheap, healthy cooking. In those days, buying a large, leafy head of raw endive cost very little at the local greengrocer. Instead of cooking the vegetable and losing its volume, mother would wash it, chop it into very fine, crisp ribbons, and fold it completely raw into a pot of piping hot, freshly mashed potatoes. The heat of the potatoes would slightly wilt the endive, but it would retain a wonderful, fresh crunch. The brilliant part was that it was a cheap way to get fresh vitamins during the darker months. The slight bitterness of the green leaves contrasted beautifully with the smooth, starchy, buttery potatoes. If it was the beginning of the month, we might get a slice of cheap smoked rookwurst on the side. But even without the meat, this dish was a favorite. The sound of the crunchy endive echoing in your head as you chewed, the warmth of the potato, it was a symphony of textures that cost mere pennies. It was fresh, it was vibrant, and it was uniquely ours. When I think of the ultimate childhood treat that cost absolutely nothing, I instantly taste the boterham met suiker, the simple bread with sugar. When times were hard, even standard sandwich toppings like Gouda cheese, peanut butter, or chocolate sprinkles were considered luxuries we could not afford every day. But children always crave something sweet. The solution was wonderfully simple and slightly absurd by today's health standards. Mother would take a slice of soft, white bread. She would apply a remarkably thick layer of real butter or margarine, ensuring it was spread all the way to the very edges of the crust. Then she would take the sugar bowl and sprinkle a heavy, snowy layer of plain, granulated white sugar right on top. The butter was crucial. It acted as the glue that kept the sugar crystals from falling off. The sensory experience of eating this was unforgettable. With every single bite, the large sugar crystals would crunch loudly between your teeth, followed by the rich, fatty taste of the butter and the soft chew of the bread. It was a cheap thrill, a poor man's pastry. We would eat it outside on the stoop, carefully brushing the stray sugar crystals off our sweaters, feeling like the richest kids in the neighborhood. As winter deepened, especially in the eastern and southern provinces of the Netherlands, a very specific, deeply traditional aroma would waft from the kitchens. It was the smell of balkenbrei. This dish was the ultimate expression of utilizing absolutely everything and wasting nothing. When a pig was slaughtered, the most expensive cuts were sold or saved for special occasions. The leftover scraps, the broth from the bones, the liver and the fatty pieces were mixed with buckwheat flour and an intoxicating blend of spices, heavily featuring cloves, allspice and nutmeg. This thick, dark grey mixture was poured into a mould and allowed to set into a solid block. When money was tight, Mother would slice this block and fry the thick pieces in a pan until the outside developed a dark, crispy, deeply savoury crust. To a modern eye, a slice of grey balkenbrei might look unappealing, but the taste was extraordinary. It was incredibly rich, earthy, and perfectly spiced. Eating it on a slice of cheap bread felt like a warm fire spreading through your body. It connected us to a long, ancient lineage of frugal farmers who respected their animals enough to use every single part. It was peasant food at its absolute finest. Now, let us smile at a culinary invention that was not a specific recipe, but rather a universal survival skill in every Dutch home, the famous plakkie. The word simply means a little mash, but it represented the art of giving leftovers a second life. On a Thursday or Friday, the refrigerator would hold a collection of sad, small portions: 2 cold potatoes, a spoonful of peas, perhaps a tiny, lonely piece of meat, or half a sausage. None of it was enough for a meal on its own. So, Mother would heat it all up, place it on our plates, and hand us a heavy fork. Our job was to aggressively mash it all together into a unified, unrecognizable, glorious paste. We would add a splash of gravy or a dollop of applesauce to bind the dry ingredients. Making a plakkie was intensely personal. Everyone had their own technique, their own perfect ratio of potato to vegetable. It was ugly food, a chaotic mixture on the plate, but the taste was always surprisingly comforting. It was a meal born out of pure necessity, ensuring not a single calorie or penny was wasted. We loved our plakkies because it meant we got to play with our food, mashing and mixing until we had created our own unique, frugal masterpiece. I want you to remember the joy of Pancake Day, not the thick, fluffy American pancakes you see today, but the traditional, large, plate-sized, thin Dutch pannenkoeken. When the budget was incredibly tight, flour, milk and an egg were usually still available in the pantry. With just these 3 cheap ingredients, our mothers could create a feast that felt like a celebration. The kitchen would get incredibly hot as the large frying pan smoked on the stove. Mother would pour the thin batter, swirling the pan to coat the bottom, and we would watch in awe as she expertly flipped it into the air. We would eat stacks of them. Because we could not afford expensive toppings, we relied on the dark, thick, beet syrup, the Schenkstroop. We would smear the dark syrup over the thin pancake, roll it up tightly like a cigar, and cut it into pieces. The sticky syrup would invariably drip down our chins and onto our fingers. We would sit at the table with sticky hands and happy hearts, completely ignoring the fact that we were eating a dinner made entirely of flour and water. It was a cheap, magical trick that turned poverty into a party, filling the house with the sweet smell of browned butter and burnt sugar. During the leaner months, our mothers were not just cooks, they were resourceful foragers. This brings us to a forgotten gem of the frugal kitchen, semmering soup, or wild sorrel soup. For this meal, the ingredients literally cost absolutely nothing because we gathered them ourselves. We would walk with our mothers to the edges of the meadows, the ditches, and the open fields, looking for the bright green, spear-shaped leaves of wild sorrel. It felt like a treasure hunt. We would fill our baskets with the wild greens and bring them back to the kitchen. Mother would wash them carefully and chop them into a pot of boiling water. The magic of sorrel is its sharp, bright, lemony flavor. To thicken the soup and make it a proper meal, she would grate a single leftover potato into the broth. The potato would melt away, leaving a velvety, tangy, bright green soup. Eating zuring soup was a deeply grounding experience. It tasted like spring, like rain, and like the wet earth of the Dutch countryside. It was a profound lesson that nature provides freely if you only know where to look. We ate it with a slice of stale bread, marveling at how a weed from the roadside could be transformed into such a delicate, delicious soup. There is one particular smell that divided many Dutch households in the 1970s, the sharp, sour, distinct aroma of karnemelksap, or buttermilk porridge. Buttermilk was significantly cheaper than regular milk, making it a staple for large families with small budgets. Mother would heat the buttermilk on the stove, carefully stirring in flour or pearl barley to thicken it into a porridge. Heating buttermilk amplifies its sourness, filling the kitchen with an incredibly pungent smell that you either loved or absolutely hated. But regardless of your stance on the smell, this cheap, acidic meal was a regular feature on our dinner tables. The secret to eating it was, once again, the liberal application of dark brown sugar or sweet syrup. The contrast was severe and beautiful, the sharp, acidic bite of the hot buttermilk clashing fiercely with the deep caramel sweetness of the sugar. You would scoop a bit of the melting sugar with the sour porridge, creating a perfect balance on the spoon. It was a humble, old-fashioned farm dish that cleared your sinuses and warmed your belly. It was undeniably absurd by modern culinary standards, but it was a true taste of our frugal, no-nonsense upbringing. Finally, we arrive at a dish that is perhaps the purest, most poignant symbol of comfort and care in a frugal Dutch household. When you were feeling sick, or when the cupboards were so bare that there was literally nothing else left, Mother would prepare a bowl of beschuit met warme melk, rusks with warm milk. A Dutch rusk, the round, dry, twice-baked bread, was placed at the bottom of a deep ceramic bowl. Mother would heat a little bit of milk in a small saucepan until it was steaming but not boiling. She would then pour the hot milk directly over the dry rusk. Instantly, the hard biscuit would hiss and absorb the liquid, swelling up and collapsing into a soft, warm, pillowy cloud. A dusting of white sugar was sprinkled on top. Eating this was like eating a warm, sweet, milky sponge. It required no chewing, just swallowing the warmth. It was incredibly cheap, costing perhaps a few cents to make, but the emotional value was immeasurable. When Mother handed you that bowl, she was handing you a tangible piece of her love, a reassurance that everything was going to be all right, even if the money jar was empty. It was the taste of pure maternal care, a gentle, humble meal that healed the body and comforted the soul. As we look back at these 20 humble meals from our past, a beautiful realization begins to dawn on us. We do not just miss the taste of the brown beans, the sweet crunch of the sugar bread, or the comforting warmth of the bread porridge. What we truly miss is the feeling of that era. We miss the slow, quiet evenings in the kitchen. We miss our youth, and most importantly, we miss the deep, unbreakable connection with the people who sat around that worn wooden table with us. Life in the 1970s and 80s taught us that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with money. It is about love, resourcefulness, and the quiet dignity of sharing what little you have with those you care about. If this journey back in time brought a tear to your eye or a warm smile to your face, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It helps us keep these precious memories alive. Now, I have a question for you. Which of these frugal meals do you miss the absolute most? Or what was your own family's special cheap recipe when times were tough? Please, write your personal story in the comments below. I promise you, I read every single one. Thank you for walking down memory lane with me today, and until next time, take care of yourselves and hold your memories close.